As you already know, climate change is not really a new phenomenon that just became an interesting topic or a hype in the last few years due to new protest forms or movements forming. This has actually been something that we have been talking about for a while, where scientists have been warning us to take actions, and environmental pollution or protection of environment from like some kind of toxic waste and other stuff has been around for even longer. So today we're going to have a look at the history of actions on climate change and stopping environmental pollution. Obviously that's going to be a short history because this is a very short video, and the intention is not to give you an exhaustive overview in every detail, but rather get you an idea, okay, where did the relevant action against climate change start? What did we achieve so far? What's the current state of affairs? And the timeline that we will look at starts 1957, where we got the first warnings for climate change by Roger Revelle and Hans Suess, and then slowly but surely working ourselves to the present day. So 1957 is where we got the first warnings. Another important date is 1958, because this is when we started to systematically measure the atmospheric CO2. The person who started this is Dave Keeling, the person that you might know from the so-called Keeling curve that we'll address in a second. And then 14 years later, in 1972, we had the first United Nations Conference on the Human Environment in Stockholm that more or less kick-started the more political conventions that were geared towards doing something for the environment against climate change. 1979, we had the first World Climate Conference in Geneva, and then in 1988, the so-called IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, was founded. You might remember the IPCC from the reports that they publish on a regular basis that we also use in the introductory sessions to give you a little bit of idea what's the difference between 1.5 degree global warming, 2, 3, and 4 degrees. We heavily relied in these lectures on the IPCC report because it provides different pathways and then giving you an idea, okay, how bad is 1.5 compared to 2.5 or 3 degrees global warming. They also publish further relevant reports and projections that are supposed to help political decision makers to act according to the threats that we are facing. We'll come back to that in a few minutes. Then 1992, the Earth Summit in Rio, followed by the 1997 Kyoto Protocol that for me, when I was younger, like I was born in 1990, so I can remember hearing this Kyoto Protocol, and from the news it was something important, but obviously I didn't really understand it back then. Then 2009, we had the Copenhagen Accord, 2015, the Paris Agreement. We'll talk about the content of all of those in a second. And then the Glasgow Climate Pact, and then 2022, the COP meetings in Egypt and Dubai this year. So let's start top to bottom. We had the first climate change warnings in 1957, now 1958, where Keeling started to systematically measure the atmospheric CO2 concentration. You might already know this so-called Keeling curve that you can see next to me. It is a graph representation of the accumulation of CO2 in the atmosphere based on continuous measurements at an observatory in Hawaii from 1958 to the present day. And as you know from the introductory sessions, a problem with too much CO2 in the air is that it fosters climate change in terms of global warming. The more CO2 there is in the atmosphere, the warmer it gets. Just to simplify it, you can go back to the previous videos to get all the implications and connections between CO2 in the atmosphere and global warming. And as you can see, Keeling goes straight up, up to more than 400 parts per million in 2022. So that was 1958, and Keeling started to record those measurements, and they continue until today. 14 years later, we had the first United Nations Conference on the Human Environment in Stockholm. It was an important milestone, but in terms of content, not so much happened. Instead, 1979, we had the first World Climate Conference in Geneva, which was really the first major meeting on climate change. It was initiated by the World Meteorological Organization, WMO, and it was supposed to be a scientific gathering that explored how climate change might affect human activities, and most importantly, it led to the creation of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, that we already talked about earlier. We used examples from them and so on and so on. What they also did is they urged governments to foresee and prevent potential man-made changes in climate that might be adverse to the well-being of humanity. So please keep in mind, that was 1979. They had some idea that climate change might be a problem. So 1979, they said, please look into this and consider that this might be a problem. Now, at the time of recording this, it's the end of 2023, we're still essentially saying the same, except for the fact that we're now saying, look, this is really a problem, we're really, really late. So this is what 44 years of climate change action got us. Just pretty much the same sentences where we changed from this might be to this is a problem. So they really did this already in 1979. We have known about this problem for quite a while. The next major event was then really the formation of the IPCC. It is part of the United Nations, it's a body of the United Nations, and its task is to provide policymakers with regular assessments of the scientific basis of climate change, its impact and future risks, and options for adaptation and mitigation. Essentially, tell the policymakers what's the state of the art on the climate change, what's the impacts, what are the risks, what are different options for adaptation and mitigation, what can we do? So what's the problem? What can we do? Policymakers, you have to make the decision. The IPCC assessment provides a scientific basis for government to develop climate-related policies, but there are really just suggestions and recommendations. The IPCC doesn't say this is what you need to do. They are policy relevant, but not policy prescriptive. They may present projections of future climate change based on different scenarios and the risks that climate change poses, and discuss the implications of response options, but they do not tell policymakers what actions to take. So those are the scenarios. If you do that, this might happen. If you do this, this might happen. So you get the idea of, like, they are laying out the facts, what you could do, what this might implicate, and what to do, but the policymakers still have to take actions. It's not the task of the IPCC. And they're also written by hundreds of leading scientists who volunteer their time and expertise as coordinating lead authors and lead authors of those reports. They enlist hundreds of other experts as contributing authors to provide complementary expertise in specific areas. The problem with that is, or something that you should keep in mind is, that if you involve hundreds of scientists from hundreds of different countries with different backgrounds, different agendas, you usually get to get a consensus on what to write down, you usually have to scale back a little bit. So you're not getting a super critical assessment with respect to a radical perspective, but rather a more conservative perspective. So what they agree upon in those IPCC reports is a more conservative approach. It's not the scaremongering, super radical approach that tells you that doomsday is imminent. This is what it already says, but it's a more conservative approach. So if you find the IPCC reports unsettling, please keep in mind that this is a conservative perspective. And yeah, we've seen examples from the IPCC. We linked it many times in our videos as resources and in the slides. Highly encourage you to have a look at the most recent IPCC reports. There are usually different versions of those reports. There is a full version that is super long, then there are an executive summary or something like an extended version. So there are different versions depending on how much time you have, what's your background, and what kind of information you are looking for. So please check out the website. It's quite helpful and gives you a lot of insights into all the details that this course cannot provide. So 1988 is where the IPCC was formed. The 1997 Kyoto Protocol was the next major milestone that is worth mentioning. As part of the Kyoto Protocol, the Kyoto Protocol in 1997 was the next major relevant milestone in our actions on climate change. It is a commitment to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and concentration in the atmosphere to a level that will prevent dangerous anthropogenic interference with the climate system. It's the first time that they recognize that global warming occurs and that human-made greenhouse gas emissions are driving it. That sounds straightforward to us nowadays, but back then this was a major step to acknowledge global warming is a thing and we are driving it. The developed nations pledged to reduce overall emissions of such gases by at least 5% below 1990 levels in the commitment period 2008 to 2012. And in this meeting, 1997, they all agreed to do that, but then they had to go back to their home countries and make sure that all of these is also essentially agreed upon by the local governments. So it took a little bit of time. But in 2005, so just 8 years later, it finally entered into force. However, the USA, Australia, and other countries refused to ratify the agreement. So that means some of the major polluter on this planet, the major countries emitting CO2, were just, yeah, sure, we support this and this is great, but we're not participating. Other countries like Canada first ratified the agreement and then withdrew from the Kyoto Protocol in 2012, so yet another large player out of the game. And this is pretty much the history of the Kyoto Protocol, that a lot of people said, yep, we're going to do something, and then one after another they backed out or never ratified it in the first place, and so on and so on. So a good gesture, but not really a major step forward. So what's now the impact of the Kyoto Protocol? Did it help us? Did it have a relevant impact on climate change, or was it just a nice goal with a lot of tam-tam that made a lot of buzz but then really never had any impact? So let's have a look at the following figure that is supposed to indicate in the gray color how the goals of the Kyoto Protocol for specific countries. So let's say for Austria, the goal was to reduce CO2 emissions by minus 13%. And in black, we have the actual values of how the CO2 emission changed from 1919 to 2009. And we can see the goal of reducing it by 30% was not really reached. Instead, they increased by 12%. And you can see the examples for some major other countries like Canada. They committed to reduce the emissions by 6%, but instead increased them by more than 20%, even though we already knew that Canada also dropped out in 2012 of the Kyoto Protocol. And then there are a few countries that actually achieved what they promised. Germany wanted to reduce their emissions by 21%, and they did 21.1%. A few other countries did so as well. So you might also now see that there are quite a few countries who have a very long negative black bar. And if you look closer, you will notice that all of them are parts of the former Soviet Union. So their decrease in CO2 emissions is mostly caused by a collapse of their economic system, therefore less emissions. So they did commit and they achieved a lot, but not voluntarily. And then there are a few other countries who blew their targets and never even got close to them. And this does not even include all the countries like the United States, who did not even show up in this list because they never ratified the agreement. So there were some positive things in that, but it was by no means enough to do what had to be done in 1997, where we had way more time than we have it now. So after 1997, the next major milestone or the next major event was the so-called Copenhagen Accord in 2009. The problem is it was only drafted by 5 countries. It was not legally binding and it did not contain any real targets. But it endorsed the continuation of the Kyoto Protocol. And they made statements like, we emphasize our strong political will to urgently combat climate change in accordance with the principles of common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities. So a lot of empty phrases that do not really yield any results. They made statements like Michel recognizing the scientific views that the increase in global temperature should be below 2 degrees Celsius. So 1.5 already in 2009, suddenly not really up for discussion anymore. We might get back to that a little bit later, but long story short, the Copenhagen Accord was more or less a absolute nonsense agreement, just drafted by 5 people, nothing legally binding in there, no real targets, just some nice comfy words that are supposed to make us feel better. But in the end, it was worth nothing. 6 years later, in 2015, we finally had the next big conference dealing with climate change, and the result was a so-called Paris Agreement. They said, okay, we have to reach the global peak of greenhouse gas emissions as soon as possible. And they also made statements that it's important to hold the increase in the global average temperature to well below 2 degrees above pre-industrial levels. And they're pursuing efforts to limit the temperature increase to 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels, recognizing that this would significantly reduce the risks and the impact of climate change. There was also talks about increasing the ability to adapt to the adverse impacts of climate change and foster climate's resilience. So we're now at the point where we say, look, stopping it is out of the question. We have to adapt to it and we have to become more resilient to climate change. So they finally recognized that. And to lower greenhouse gas emission development in a manner that does not threaten food production and making financial flows consistent with a pathway towards low greenhouse gas emissions, which just means how can we funnel more money into saving our planet, or hoping that it really saves our planet and it's not just another greenwashing scheme. So they made all of these claims in the Paris Agreement, but in the end, nothing really happened once again, because all of this were just statements to commit. There was once again nothing legally binding. A lot of the large players somehow found ways to either back out or to just keep parts of this relevant. The USA, first of all, came into the Paris Agreement, then Trump came and they went out of the Paris Agreement. So once again, a lot of nice words, but nothing really follows out of this. So we're just back to where we have been earlier in 2009, nothing. So 6 years later, we have the so-called Glasgow Climate Pact that is supposed to reaffirm the Paris Agreement temperature goal of holding the increase in global average temperature to well below 2 degrees, and that 1.5 degree would be obviously better. So are just reaffirming that thing that didn't really do anything in the last 6 years and stating, yep, this is really important. But in their defense, they also added a few new goals, like including accelerating efforts towards the phase out of unabated coal power and inefficient fossil fuel subsidies. Just adding this inefficient fossil fuel subsidies, so they are still using so-called efficient fossil fuel subsidies. And they also urge developed countries to provide enhanced support, including through financial resources, technology transfer, and capacity building to help developing countries to also do their part. In the end, 140 countries pledged to reach net zero emissions. By when? 100 countries pledged to reverse deforestation by 2030, and up to 40 countries pledged to move away from coal. Very important, they all just pledged. Once again, nothing legally binding, no major step forward. Moving towards the present day, the next climate change conference of the United Nations in 2022 took place in Egypt, in Sharm el-Sheikh. To summarize the results, there were no relevant results, but interestingly, more than 600 fossil fuel lobbyists registered to attend, and you might wonder whether they were attending or participating to obtain further education on actions on climate change, or if they attended in their capacity as lobbyists for the fossil fuel industry to do the exact opposite. And now, as of the recording of this video in the middle of November 2023, the 2023 version of the United Nations Climate Change Conference did not happen yet. It happens at the end of November, so in a few weeks. And it's supposed to be hosted in Dubai. And the designated president is Sultan Al Jaber. You might not have heard of him before. I also didn't know who he is. But interestingly, he is the CEO of the Abu Dhabi National Oil Company and now heading the conference on climate change. So you can probably expect the results of this climate change event. They're probably very, very much limited. And this nicely sums up the whole short history of political action when it comes to climate change and environmental pollution. So we cut out a lot, we try to reduce it a lot, we try to focus on the major events here, and I have to admit, of course, something happened. It's not like all of those events didn't do anything. Like, we took actions on various topics and they had an impact and they prevented worse behavior. But given the drastic events that we now are dealing with and what is predicted and forecasted by scientists for, I don't know, 50, 60, 70 years now, we're still doing not closely enough to prevent them. And the 2023 United Nations Climate Change Conference in Abu Dhabi is probably not going to change much. So this is where we are standing right now.